everyone. Thank you very much. And we will proceed now to the town hall debate on health and disability, moderated by Eileen John. All very well known to all of you.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll probably stand up a bit easier to see if there's questions coming from the room. So, ladies, it's the two ladies that we have here this morning. You can look at this in one of two ways. You can think, oh my God, we're going to have to do more talking. Or you can say, oh great, we have a better opportunity to do more talking. So it's either way. We might just, because we're a bit late anyway, we might just shrink it a bit. And hopefully more people will join us as we go along. We have apologies now from Sean Canny, TD, independent TD. His car broke down, so in fairness to him. And on a morning like this, it's not going to be easy to get it done. So, but we're delighted to have with us Councillor Vicky Casserly from Fine Gael, recently re-elected to her seat on South Dublin County Council as a representative for Lucan. And yeah, go gorgeous, Vicky. I mean, we're all glued to it, and we all love our elections in this country. And it's never easy, and anyone who puts themselves forward at any stage has to be admired. And to be out then, and I know you have a son doing leaving cert and all the rest of it, so you're great to be here this morning after the weekend you put on and all of that. Vicky is passionate about accessibility and equality for people with disabilities, campaigning alongside her son James, who's a wheelchair user with a particular interest in accessible public transport. And then we're also joined by Senator Annie Hoy from the Labour Party. Now, Annie, will you be running for the Dáil whenever it happens? That's the next question. So she's a Labour Party senator, a member of the Committee on Health, Diversity, Equality and Inclusion. These are all principles that are close to Annie's heart as she continues to mobilise and lobby for change as a senator. She's passionate about accessible transport options and regularly participates in Disability Pride Month, which is next month, which is July. Okay, so I suppose I'm going to just ask a couple of general questions and let the ladies talk, and then we really welcome your questions from the floor. You've both highlighted, and we've said earlier, that it's one of particularly pertinent this year, so accessibility. What's lacking, what's missing, what needs to be done, what can be done? Vicky, because you're closest to me, I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Eileen. And good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here this morning, and thank you for having me. Accessibility is something really, really close to my heart. As Eileen mentioned, my son, who is 18 and a half, is a wheelchair user. So I suppose from very early days, accessibility was something that became very pertinent in our lives. But I would say the first obstacle with accessibility is the understanding of what accessibility is and the education to everybody, the nature of, the depth of different access needs, from ramps to, even this morning I learned a slide door could have braille, so somebody's reaching out can understand, have the option to have that access requirement met by using a tool there to enable that independence. There's so much more that needs to be done. We do have our legislation there, but our legislation, I feel, and this is something I've pushed the past 10 years, it gives a basic line, it's a baseline. And everyone will say, oh, well, we're compliant. Well, let's not be compliant. Let's go beyond compliance. And I suppose as a public representative on a local authority, we have the opportunity to do that within our development plans. So it's using that opportunity to push beyond the baseline, to make those measures, I suppose, better, more improved for everyone in our community, because disability, there's nobody is exempt from disability. Every single person could experience it, live it, or learn about it along life's path. So I think one thing for me, Eileen, is really the education surrounding accessibility. It's not just ramps, it can be communication boards, braille, changing place facilities as well. The accessible bathrooms that are the step, they're actually now legislated for, I think, since Christmas, but they weren't. But again, I know when James was younger and I had my youngest Tom, he was 9 yesterday, don't invite 25 kids indoors to a house. When I say organised chaos, we left out the organised. But when Tom was a newborn and I would go out with James to help him meet his needs. An accessible bathroom didn't allow for a wheelchair user, a pram, and a carer present, but the changing places now offer that facility. And within our local authority, I lobbied hard for that since 2014, and that's become the standard practice. So it's seeing, understanding, and pushing beyond the baseline.
So if you say legislation is there but it's not being enacted, whose responsibility is that then?
Well, it's enforcement. It does need to be enforced, and doesn't the planning regulator needs to do it. Most places will adhere to the baseline of the regulations, but the baseline isn't always the best course of action. It's pushing beyond that. And I suppose roles of politicians and public representatives is to lobby the legislators to develop, it's like the Part M for changing place facilities, to have that included in it. Let's just not accept the base, let's push for excellence.
Okay, Annie?
Yes, thanks so much for having me here today. I suppose my perspective is a little bit different. Obviously I'm a legislator and I've always had an interest in these areas, and I would have considered myself someone who was like very attuned to things, like, oh, I know about these things, I know about accessibility. And then I was in an accident last year and my life was turned upside down, and I've had to learn to live with a whole new way of living. And, you know, people would have often in my career come to me being like, oh, what should we do about accessibility here? What should we do about accessibility there? And it turns out I actually had absolutely no idea what it was like to navigate the world as a person with a disability until it happened to me. And I would have, you know, as I said, I would have considered myself relatively in tune with things. So when Vicky's talking about that education piece, like, what do people understand it to be to navigate the world as a disabled person? Of course, there's all sorts of varieties and differentials in that. And therefore, who are the people who are making decisions around this? So it's interesting when you're saying, like, who enforces these things? And I've been in lots of different spaces and stuff where there's conversations about different authorities, and I'm not going to start naming off different authorities, and we won't get into any of that, but, you know, who is in charge of enforcing things? What lived experience does that particular authority have? What lived experience do the people who are going and doing the accessibility assessments of buildings, like, what lived experience do they have of how to navigate a space? And is there that lived experience on that authority, on that board, in that organisation? Or is there, with the best will in the world, a checklist being done of, these are what we think are things that make things accessible, and then they go through and we tick all these things off. And then when the actual people who need to use the space get in, they're like, why in the name of goodness would you have done this here, put that there? Do you know what I mean? So I think that's a really important thing, is that education piece, but also who is in charge of deciding what our accessible places look like, what is accessibility. I'm particularly interested in around the idea of universal design. I'm very glad, for example, my house that I have, it was a requirement for there to be an accessible bathroom in that house. And of course then when I had my accident, that made the world of difference about whether or not I could stay at home. And if I didn't have that accessible bathroom and therefore could live downstairs, I don't know how we would have managed. And that was because that was an enforcement, that was a requirement that my home was made accessible, unbeknownst to anyone what that was going to be. And I sometimes discuss with housing people and stuff, you know, as we all know, the cost of housing is through the roof. They're like, oh, well, if we didn't have to have accessible bathrooms in them, that would reduce the cost of the house by 20,000, just all of these things. I was like, every single person at some point in their life is possibly going to need an accessible bathroom, and a saving, quote unquote, that you're making at the beginning is going to end up costing someone much more in the long run if they have to convert parts of their house. So, I mean, even stuff like conceptualizing what do we mean by accessibility, and if we're talking about, you know, people who are in housing regulations being like, oh, we'll cut this because it'll be a cost-saving measure now, but for the individual who ends up, very likely, I think a lot of people will end up needing things like accessible bathrooms as they go through the trials and tribulations of life. You know, those sort of cost quote unquote, I don't like to use cost saving because I don't think we should be cutting anything to do with accessibility. But those are all things that maybe I wouldn't have even considered. And it's really interesting to me now when I'm in those spaces where people are like, oh, well, this is how we'll make housing more affordable. And I feel like kind of screaming, being like, you're not making housing more affordable by cutting out the accessibility of housing. That's going to end up costing people so much more in the long run to convert and make their homes accessible. So I think that education piece is so important in terms of who's making decisions as to what is accessible, what is the lived experience there, and are we future planning our places to make them accessible? we all know stories of people who have to, book ahead 24 hours in advance to use the train. And I've had to take running jumps using my stick as a kind of like a pogo thing to get off trains in Cork because the gap is so big. And it was kind of funny, and we all laughed as I kind of leapt off the train. But it also isn't acceptable that we kind of have to, rely on people. We need to do a lot better than that. And I don't know. And I suppose the last thing I'll end on is that idea of, I think we still continue sometimes to prioritise aesthetics and buildings and historical this, that, and the other, and using the reason of, oh, well, it's old and it's this and it's that and it's the other, for reason that we don't make places accessible. I think people and the people who use buildings are much more important than the brick and mortar that they're made from. I think people being able to get on and off trains is much more important. I have a limit to what I think we could justify as a cost-saving measure, and I would hope, and I think the idea of universal design is becoming so much more common now. We see it in our third-level institutions, any new buildings that have been made, like Grange Gorman and places like that. This concept of universal design, making sure that they're fully accessible. But I don't think people in a lot of our decision-making places, whether that's perhaps in housing, transport, have really, I think, an actual meaningful understanding of what it's like to navigate a space as a disabled person, whatever that disability is, and what does a universally designed train station look like? What does a universally designed home look like? And if the conversation is, well, we'll save money now, but we'll just put the cost on the individual at a later point in their life, that means to me that we need a lot more education for those decision makers, because I think it's too important to be cost saving when actual individuals and our lives are literally at stake sometimes trying to navigate these spaces.
Do you want to pick back up on that?
Yeah, I suppose just on the transport side of things, I've been for the past 2 years along with my sons and my partner, we have been travelling the 32 counties of Ireland using just public transport. So from city to rural. Jimbo's Accessible Adventures if you're interested. But the one thing we found is the more rural you go, the more challenging it becomes. And James now has a girlfriend from Cork, so he's up and down from Cork quite a lot. But what I would say is the time has now been reduced. You shouldn't have to put in a request for a ramp. But the one thing we learned, and I feel like we've learned every little nook and cranny along the way, if it is a busy station, like a major station, you don't really have to. The train driver can do it. If it is in a smaller station, the train drivers are trained to put the ramps down, and they should be able to clearly identify you on the platform. So it shouldn't limit anybody's ability to travel spontaneously as well. The one really interesting piece there that I picked up on is the lived experience. And we've learned over the years as well, the UK actually do things slightly differently. So when they're doing their consultative panels, they actually involved lived experienced people, but they're actually paid employment as well. So not only is it meeting markers for making sure that there is equity in employment in terms of persons with disability, it gives choice. You also have to remember a person with disability does not always have to divulge. It is not compulsory to say, I have a disability, but they do give lived experience within those panels. So the output, as you're saying, is coming from a lived experience perspective, and it's also through paid employment. So it's actually valuing the lived expertise of a person with a disability. And I think that's where we need to, actually up our game in that regard, because there's a lot we can learn. And I'm not just talking about ramps, visuals, every element, I suppose, of universal design. We can really benefit as a country and as legislators if we use the same basis in terms of how we do things.
Okay, I just want to pick you up there on, I didn't realise that James was the Jimbo's Adventure, so for people who don't know anything about that, tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so James is 18, he has cerebral palsy, and we have a little bit of a list, and the other one he shares is his juvenile arthritis. But James has had a number of surgeries over the year, but during COVID he was very much, and I never like using the word bedbound, but he was bedbound post-surgery for a long period of time. So 2 years ago, he's a huge interest in public transport, as in we have framed bus routes in his bedroom along with Pele jerseys as well. It's a bit of a mixed bag. But he had decided, he asked me one day, can we do this? Can we travel the country? Because I want to be able to, A, show people you can do it, but if you can't do it, well, why can't you do it? And what can we do to fix it? So a lot of time there is funding available. That's what James has learned. So for example, we went to Donegal. We were travelling by bus Éireann. We couldn't get off at the bus stop because the infrastructure wasn't there to meet the needs, but there is funding available from the NTA. The local authority have to be encouraged to go and do this. So James has basically documented it and with our help, and then we've extended it to visiting tourist places. So we did a piece on Nationwide, and RTE News had a piece out there a few weeks ago. But again, it's advocacy, and he uses his voice to try and do it in a constructive way, because we feel that you're heard more when you're not shouting. So it's how you portray your message that you want to be heard as well. So
And people can find it. He's all over social media. Where can people find him?
He's on Twitter or X, whatever you choose to call it, and Instagram as well.
Okay. Well, now, before I open to the floor, one thing that you've mentioned there is high costs, Senator Hoey, particularly. So most of the people with post-polio syndrome are hitting pension age soon, or now, already, whatever. How can we improve the lives of people maybe living close to the poverty line as a result of their age? Because when they reach pension age, they're given the old age pension rather than a disability allowance and may lose out on benefits.
Yeah, I've become quite firm in my belief. So, this isn't me coming up with like party policy on the hoof or anything like that. We have this idea children's allowance is given regardless of your income, because there's a recognition that having a child has a cost associated with it, and the state should participate in supporting that. And I've been talking to a lot of people where, I'm becoming increasingly of the belief that I think disability payment should be, there should be a baseline below which no one should be able to fall. I think we should have a social security floor beneath which people cannot fall, and I think there probably should be an element of a disability payment. That is, if you have a disability, you get the payment. And I in our office, we work with people all the time who have had their their payment refused once, twice, three, and then on the fourth go, they then get it. So, do you know what I mean? We do, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room who have experienced, this hoops that people sometimes have to jump through, and it requires tenacity and determination, which I don't think we should be putting people through. I think there should be a baseline that we recognise that if you have disability, it should be treated the same way as the children's allowance, and that you should have that baseline payment in order, we're coming around to the concept of universal basic income. We're doing that for artists, and I personally believe that we should have that line below which no one can fall, and then whatever way that works with the pension, that works. Obviously, I'm not overly fond of this ever increasing pension age that we seem to potentially be having. We're going to have a pension age, and by the time I'm becoming a pension age, I reckon I'll be 80 something that I'll get to retire. So, I think we also have to look at the feasibility and the reasonability of the pension age and what age we're cutting that off at. But I do think that there should be a disability payment that is simply, if you have disability, you get the payment, and we don't do this means testing, and it's not cut then when you acquire or you avail of other social services. That's my opinion. I don't know if that's across popular opinion.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Vicky?
Yeah, it's a discussion that's happened in our house, and with disability comes additional costs. So whether you're pension age, like if you're 59 today and 60 tomorrow, you're still in the same physical condition you were the day before. And I think, it should be, I believe personally, there should be a direct payment for persons with disability, and that's something I would be advocating and supporting strongly. And as you were saying, even when it's coming to applying for disability allowance, I suppose the universal design in terms of the approach for that, it's still a standard form, and people often aren't aware you can ask for or if you have to go to appeal and they're not understanding the depth of what's going on, you can request oral hearing. You can go in front of somebody and do it in an interview based as well, or conversationally, but there are a lot of barriers there. We do have the long-term illness scheme, there are frameworks there that can be used to enhance what is already there and maybe put in new plans. And I think that needs to be looked at holistically, but certainly disability does cost, whatever way you look at it, and that needs to be acknowledged and shouldn't be differentiated between age and pension.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to open it to the floor now, so I hope you have all your questions lined up, and maybe there's some coming in online as well. Look at our award winner, hand up first. There's a microphone just coming to you there, Mick.
Question, first of all, Councillor, when you're passing stuff on in council, could it be made sure that it's disability proof? Because once it gets out, it's very, very hard to actually change plans. We need it done right from the beginning to make sure that's done. Oh, by the way, when you turn 65, your disability disappears. You don't have a disability. And another thing is, it's really important that we look at the cost of disability. I've been at 2 conferences where it was 27%, 36% the cost of people with disability in different things, you know. So we really, and I know, I think it was last year, the year before, when he did a cost of disability, and then he came out with the green paper, which was shambolic, you know, ridiculous. He went through what the Conservative government in England did, and ended up with an awful lot of people with disability committing suicide over it. So I'm glad that's gone. So you know, you really have to look at the cost of disability. Oh, let somebody else go on. So, but they're just 2 very major things as well. Oh, just one more thing. PPNs, okay? I would like the councillors of the council around Ireland to actually help those in the PPN. They're there for a reason. Public participation network. And we have things where the councillors don't interact with us. So that's very important. Thank you.
Okay.
I suppose we were fortunate within our local authority, and I sound very parochial, within South Dublin County Council, we were actually the first to ever have a Disability Access Equality Officer. Selena Bonney, who did sadly pass away in January.
Excuse me, could I ask you how long that is actually going on for? How long is that last? How long is the meeting for? Because you're not supposed to be sitting here, you know, in reception.
Okay, just half minute and then go.
Yeah, no problem.
Background educationally is disability studies and equality.
But I'm
Diversity. So when I'm looking at plans that come before local councillors and meetings, that's absolutely all my effort goes into that. And to the point where the night before, or after our budget was passed last November, the head of finance said he woke up the night before panicking. Did he have enough funding in something to ensure it was accessible? So he made my day that he's dreaming about it now. So I think there are positive steps to be there. And in a personal capacity with the Association of Local Government, I have gone and spoken to councillors nationally about the role of public representatives in forward planning in their local authority, including public realm planning and housing as well. I absolutely, in terms of the PPN, I wholeheartedly agree. We do have a disability consultative panel within our local authority. It's been there for about 15 years, where a PPN rep is invited along, and we do give the opportunity to engage with local councillors as well. I do think social change is never fast unless it's popular. And I don't believe this should be something that's done just to be popular. It has to be done from a good place. But I hope other local authorities are following suit in terms of the PPN. And just to say, and I know I'm in a government party, even as a local councillor, but I agree with you in terms of the green paper.
Dublin has been named the 9th most expensive city and what's in the park.
Thank you.
Brian,
I was involved in that as well, yeah. Thank
we
you.
have to say on the call that big. When you go in,
Yeah, I suppose when we talk about the cost of disability, I think the most recent study is about €12,000 per year, which is like, that's an astonishing amount of money to expect people to be able to work when they may not even have access, to the state supports they're designed to make sure we don't necessarily fall through the cracks, but they're not, they're not giving people a flahool lifestyle either. I think they could and should be an awful lot more. So that 12,000 is an enormous amount of money for people to have to come up with. We know all of the stats around employment and all of the other areas. And I think it's great that South Dublin County Council actually hired someone, following on from what you're saying about hiring people to work in this area. And I very often feel, as someone who works somewhat in the equality sector within higher education, there's DEI people who gets kind of covering really a very broad range of things and are supposed to and are expected to come in and kind of solve all of the diversity, equality, inclusion, belonging issues in a place or an institution or an organisation. And that is obviously an impossible task when we have a world that has been designed to keep all sorts of people out. So I think a much deeper understanding of what DEI is, and actually, as Nikki says, paying people for their expertise and paying people for their time to be on our councils, our local authorities, our higher education institutions, I think is really, really important. And I would love to see whether it has to come from central government or whether it has to come through the various organisations, like actual meaningful investment in terms of funding in order to be able to hire those people, and not kind of just leaving it to one person who kind of has to carry the entire equality agenda on their shoulders, and they're being pulled every which way with the best intentions in the world. Like really meaningful, targeted funding for very specific, particularly around accessibility, I think would be really important.
Okay, I see a gentleman here. Yeah, you might tell us what your name, who your name is, and where you're from.
Oh, sorry. Okay. My name is Pat McCabe, and I'm from Dublin South. One of the questions I have is quite simple. Every so often around the country, which I travel a lot, up and down the country, as do some of my colleagues here sitting beside me. What I've noticed is they fix roads, retar roads, the whole lot, even outside here in this hotel here. But they forget about the paths. And the paths are just in need of repair as the roads do be. For example, I was told of one across the road at the traffic lights over here on the main road. When you're turning off, you may notice there's different size wheelchairs around here. They've all got different wheels on them. And one of the at the traffic light, when you turn it into the traffic light, the wheel dips. Now that's just an example. But around the country there's broken paths everywhere. And what I'm saying is, can we not get people, when they're repairing the roads, to have a look at the paths as well and fix them?
General agreement on that. Thank you, Pat.
I think, I suppose when I was first elected in 2014, I'd done a walk around my home estate because that's where I lived and where the challenges were arriving for us to be able to get outside the hall door. So I do agree with you there, but I suppose what I would suggest to anyone in the room, contact your local representatives, make sure it's included in budget. When it's that's a health and safety matter, that's not just a maintenance matter, it's health and safety, and it's hindering your ability to travel independently within your community. And just bring your public reps along and have that conversation and ensure that the funding is there, that does happen alongside the works as well.
Work with the councillors, and we do bring them around if we spot something that we think is wrong. We do bring them around and tell them, show them. We even take photographs. But I can't do that around the countryside. Because if I go out of my area, I'm told that's a different council.
No, I understand that, but I think in terms of, I suppose, if everyone in this room has something, from different parts of the country, or even with the organisation themselves, I mean, there's nothing to stop putting a call out for public reps, to meet with the different access groups or individuals in each area. You're making this call as an organisation to improve mobility within the community.
The reason I brought
wasn't re-elected, so maybe that's why he's not here.
But that's why I was pointing out in particular
Yeah.
around here.
Yeah.
But I do know that around the different areas that we travel. We travel up to Galway and other places.
Senator Hoy.
Yeah, I've developed suddenly a real interesting thought on footpaths and bits and pieces because when I was in my wheelchair, it really made me think about where we can make something accessible for one person, but it makes it inaccessible for another person. And I'd never even thought about that level of kind of diversity within the accessibility needs of the community. And I had a friend of mine who is visually impaired, and we were coming to cross the road, and he was, the bumps at where the light, and sure, I was nearly being tossed out of the chair, trying to get over on the bumps where he needed those in order to be able to see to cross the road. And I'd never even, I think for people who don't have experience of this or lived reality, accessibility needs to become kind of this homogenous, this is accessibility, these are the things we do, and now it's suddenly accessible to everyone. Whereas I was kind of being flung off one way, and he was laughing because he was like, he won't be able to get around Dublin City without those on it. And then I was like, oh my God, I'm actually going to fall over because of the way the footpath was. I was going to be knocked out of my chair. And we were just laughing about how neither of us had actually thought about the different. He was like, I never thought about these as actually being potentially a barrier to someone who's in a wheelchair or had a mobility issue, whereas he couldn't function going through Dublin City Centre without the bumps in front of to be able to cross the road. And that really got me thinking about how the entire spectrum of needs in order to make something accessible. But certainly I was stunned going through our Dublin main capital, and the amount of times I was caught nearly being flung out of my chair, that the person who was wheeling me would grab me because of a sudden dip of the footpath, or they'd go to try and, as you were saying, turn me off the footpath, and there'd be a sudden dip, and suddenly the chair was kind of nearly doubling back on itself when we were doing a horseshoe, and I was coming back up onto the footpath, and we had great laughs about them and stuff, and it was all very funny, but actually it's not that funny to nearly be tossed off your chair when you're trying to go around somewhere safely. But it really opened my eyes to this idea of making something accessible in one way can actually make something inaccessible in another way. So that idea of that universal design and who's designing spaces, and could there be a space at the side of making the crossways for people with visual impairments? Could there be a smoother area therefore then that people can get across at a different point? Is that a conversation we need to have about how we make crossings accessible for people with both visual impairments and who don't want to be tossed out of their chairs because the bumps are too bumpy?
I just want to bring in, I'll come to you now in a second, we have a question in from Joyce Henderson, who's joining us on Zoom. And Joyce, thank you. Vicky, this is probably one for you and maybe for some of you in the audience. Are expressway buses accessible for wheelchair users?
I don't believe so.
No.
I don't believe so. No, I can check and come right back to you, but I don't believe so. No. And
we can tell, they can,
Joyce,
they say no in the audience, they say no.
I have one, I'll just tell you this
Of course they should.
there's one kind of funny, not funny story that we like to tell. So James was the first person to look to use a bus errand bus going from Dublin to Wexford. And there was a few things in it, and it's talk about dignity and ability to travel independently. Turned up to the station, and they didn't know how to use the ramp. They were trained 2 years ago, but weren't aware of how to use the ramp to lift James on. The bus was an hour and 20 minutes late departing from Busaurus. Passengers on the bus were getting a bit irate at this young person looking to go on the bus, so his dignity was kind of, faltered by it. But when they got to Wexford, thankfully, he rang me laughing. I was like, what's so funny? Well, they left the key for the ramp in Dublin, Mum. So, but I suppose the way we went about that was, we managed, he had a whole 20 minutes in Wexford that day and came home. But I suppose our approach on that was, we asked Bus Éireann that, okay, if everyone's trained how to use the lifts on and off, we'd actually urge you to make sure this is done as part of your weekly checks, because don't assume a person with reduced mobility is not going to want to use their bus on any given day.
Sure.
Small change.
Okay, this man here with the beard. Just hold on for a second till the microphone gets Is that the case? I'm just going to ask, is that the case for other members? If you put up your hands just to say how many people have found out that the records are not there? Okay. Would either of you like to address it, Vicky?
Yeah, I'm actually very taken back by that, John. But I know I can't do anything about it here, but I'd certainly like talk to, if there's one person that wants to coordinate, and I can try and lobby, I suppose the powers that be in government to have this investigated, because medical notes shouldn't just disappear. And it's your story.
Part of the historical record, a hospital record from St. Joseph's School, transferred from County Westmeath upon the closure of St. Joseph's as a hospital, and they were sent to the local authority in Meath, where they were to be securely stored. They were then transferred within Meath from one building to another, at which point all records cease. And all personnel connected claims to approach. Trying to trace other records relating to those who I have found there are significant gaps in departmental records in various departments. I'm not suggesting that anything specific happened, but I just find it curious that any effort to track our medical history and what we may have gone through, or what may have been done to us in the name of medical research, is no longer accessible. My surgeries, and I had 24, I can find no track or record. Some of them were done purely for experimental purposes. I found out they're bad. Somebody who worked in a particular institution and find absolutely no trace of any historical record. And I just would like to see some effort made on that, like those who might have access, either in coroner's power, so to say, or within the Department of Health, because again, they've just run up against a brick wall and identical fraud within the Department of Health.
Well, I think Vicky has given you an undertaking that she'll follow that up. There's a gentleman behind you there, just with the glasses, and I'll come over here. Do I see a hand here? Then, yeah.
Yeah, my name is Liam Porter from Dublin. Now, one of the panel speakers there talked about the disability payment, across the board for most people. And of course, there was research there saying that the cost of disability is about 12,000 a year. Now, I mean, okay, it'd be great if we could get a disability payment. I just don't see that happening, and I'll tell you why. Because basically, the previous speaker mentioned about trying to get a medical card. And basically, the ignorance out there, the previous speaker spoke about it, that polio is just not recognised. No, I think the reason why it's not recognised is because it's very convenient not to recognise it. Therefore, no payment can be made. Now, the thing about it is, if we're not going to get a medical card, I just don't see us getting a disability payment, and especially if the disability payment is going to be across the board, not just for polio people. Now, a medical card is a basic need. If it's going to cost you about £12,000 a year, how much is a medical card going to cost the government? It's going to be a lot less than that, And I think it's a total disgrace, what the previous speaker says, that, polio is not recognised. Now, as you get older, the symptoms get a lot worse. Therefore, the costs go up astronomically. And really, there's a member of Fine Gael here who's in government at the moment. And I really think it should be passed on, because it's just so convenient for them not to recognise polio. And I think when this gentleman was asked for all these records, I think he was just being fobbed off, because they don't need all those records, really. A simple medical examination would have done, because they would have been easily able to see that he was suffering from polio. So that's my gripe.
Okay. Well, I think you have to commend your society for inviting the politicians here today to listen to your concerns and to have the chance and the opportunity to respond.
Thanks so much. And I think the first thing I'll say is, as I said to John, I'm quite happy. I am a local councillor, but I'm quite happy to reach out to the powers that be to have this looked at, and that's not an issue at all. And just in terms of recognising polio, and I can only speak for myself, but I'm here. I'm here because I recognise it, and I'm doing my best in terms of advocacy and trying to improve lives for everyone in our community, and because I realise the impact it can have on your day-to-day health and ability to live your life to the best potential you can. So just to say, I'm here because I recognise it, and I'm doing my best, and will continue to do my best in that regard as well. Honey?
I'll just say that I've nothing against anybody individually, you or any other member of the panel. My gripe is basically with this government and previous governments and not recognising polio as a recognisable disability and issuing it.
Yeah, I have a couple of notes here. There's a limit to what senators can put in, but we can, through parliamentary questions, I know there's a former senator here in the room, we can put in either commencement matters and ask the minister to come in on questions, or we can put in parliamentary questions on that. And Vicky, I'm sure, has the same pathway through colleagues as well. And I'm certainly happy to work with the organisation as to how to word those to get the answers that you're looking for. That's no problem to fire those in. We can get those in by the end of the day if we want to do that. Happy to do that.
Now I have a lady waiting over here, and then we'll come to the back and then to the front.
It's just something very personal. When I was pregnant, my gynecologist said to me, "Can you get your records?" Because he didn't know, would I have to have a section or would I have to have the baby naturally. So I looked up the orthopaedic in Cork, no record of my operations because I had hip operations. But they had a record of me when I got the polio during the pandemic in Cork City. So they couldn't take an x-ray because the fetus could be damaged. So it was after the baby being born then that I had to have a section, and they were able to take an x-ray. So that'll just tell you how serious it is not having a record of your operations. You don't know when they will come into play.
Okay, thank you for that, Chair. Yeah. Now there was a gentleman at the back there. You have your hand up?
No, Seamus Walton, Mulhudder. I'd just like to inform the politicians, I don't know if they know, our mobility allowance, driving mobility allowance, it hasn't increased since, I think, 2011. It's 260, I think, for if you don't have a car. But if you have a car, it's halved. And mine now is 124.25 per month, and this has been that way since 2011. I'm just wondering how did inflation since 2011? If you could tell people, especially people in governments here, to inform their colleagues, if they'd look into that.
It's not something I have an answer for today, I'm not going to lie to you, but I can certainly, if you want to give details at the end, we can certainly, myself or Annie can kind of look into that.
Just one other question too. I know this is a bit double-centered, but it's in relation to that they're going to change the traffic plans for central Dublin, I think in the autumn, And is there going to be an announcement for people with badges driving, even more parking spaces in central Dublin and access, through the quays and whatever, I think they're going to limit it, I think, even more. And that's the Green Party since they came in, even though I totally agree with Green politics and whatever, but still, I think they have to, think of people with disabilities,
Now I promised I'd come to the front here. Yeah, you're next. Wait, we just get a microphone to you now for a second.
My name is Yomi from Dublin. Two questions or issues. One of them has to do with orchard, how people just take over access, private people parking their cars and denying you access as a wheelchair user. I mean, it's pervasive, it's all over the place. Sometimes you really just have to navigate very tiny spaces, and or when you approach some places, you just have to start figuring how best to go around cars and not become a problem to yourself, and that kind of thing. It's, as I said, really, really pervasive. The RSA is not concerned about this. It will say, I've seen a lot of adverts about this, and nobody's doing anything about it. I just thought that should be mentioned. The other one has to do with the kind of apprehension that comes up when, as a recipient of disability payments, you have to take up employment. The apprehension about losing your entitlements. Disability doesn't disappear. You've talked about how we need to have a baseline, something, whether you have a disability or not, this has to be paid to you. I mean, when you have a disability, this has to be paid to you, whether you're working or not. I recently had this apprehension when I wanted to take up employment, and we had to start doing all kinds of calculations around how many hours I would need to work and not have my entitlement all taken away. And I thought that was really very unfortunate, very unfair. And one of the things I was reminded of is what someone mentioned a while ago about how when you even have to get onto when you have to prove that you have disability, what you really have to go through. I recall that when I was applying for disability allowance, I had to, go to the undignified extent of sending them a picture of myself sitting on the floor with my pair of calipers next to me and my two legs showing really that I'm disabled before they believed me. So, and someone reminded me, do you want to go through that again if you take up this employment? I think we should address this.
Thank you. There is, a few things there. I know what you're saying when you're going out and about, the challenges navigating with cars, sandwich boards, wheelie bins, but there are some great campaigns out there like Make Way Day, where the local authorities, when engaged, they do a year round. I know in our local authority we do a year round trying to encourage people not to do these things and try and show why. So it kind of links into that educational piece, but also we give that visual as well, which can help quite a lot. I know in terms of the misuse of accessible parking bays, a number of years ago, I'm from Lucan, I got involved in the Back in 5 campaign. So every time somebody pulled out of a regular parking space, I borrowed a few wheelchairs. I have a few friends, and we put the wheelchair in the regular parking bay. Back in 5, I'm gone to the bank. The next car pulled out, I put another wheelchair in. Back in 5, gone to the shop. Back in 5, gone to get milk. Anyway, I had the guards involved as well, so I was good. But in effect, the only spaces that were left available were the accessible parking bays. But to help that key understanding piece as to how it can actually hinder somebody's ability to do their day-to-day tasks in the community, I worked with a local disability action group, so we had information there where we were having conversations with people who A, saw the humour, B, went, oh God, you're really after making me think twice about that, and C, it's no longer a major issue in Lucan Village now. So you can have one very effective, simple campaign that can actually help with these things. And I mean, Lucan Village is wedged the best of times, so it was a bit of a gamble now whether or not it was going to pay off, but it worked. I actually really hear what you're saying about the entitlement and the loss of, disability. As I said, my son is 18. He's hopefully going to, to do a college course in September, but he's already talking about working, and he's like, if I take full-time work, I lose my medical card. And he has an autoimmune condition, so he's on biologics and a lot of kind of high-level medicines, that would be significant, which brings you back to the cost of disability. So either you have your baseline cost of disability payment, or you retain your medical card irrespective, because your medical needs are still going to be ongoing. But I do think, I know they had a program, Department of Social Protection, to incentivize people with, to employers to, through grants, to take people on to have a disability. That's very controversial in our house. Like, we understand why it's there, but we don't believe that it's given that full equality equity that, my son's knowledge and worth. I have an invisible disability, I have a lung condition, but my knowledge, James's knowledge, is just as valuable as your knowledge. And why would it be incentivized to take me on for employment and not you? Now, you get why it has to happen in terms of social change, but at the same time, it's a very tricky situation to try and balance that. But in terms of the entitlements, a big thing for my son working full time, and hopefully he will, but a big concern for him is losing his medical card, because he'll still have that ongoing cost without a disability payment and without a medical card. So disability does cost. So that is why I will keep shouting at the top table.
Annie, do you want to?
I think I've worked with people where we have sat down and on a piece of paper calculated the cost of them taking a job versus the cost of them not taking a job, and we go through how would they get to the job, what would they need to do it, and what would they do. And that, I never thought when I became a public rep that I'd be sitting down with someone, and I'm terrible maths, but being like, actually, even saying the sentence, it's not worth your time doing it. Like, that's a terrible system that we have, where we have people where it's not worth, financially, worth their while doing something where we have so much and we pride ourselves on the government of the stats of like, we're in full employment, and I'm kind of jumping in the background going, actually, for a number of communities, traveller communities, disabled communities, all of these other communities, you're nowhere, you're minus full employment. These figures, I think, hide as well some of the realities when you start working your way down through different groupings of people, and particularly traveller people and people with disabilities and disabled people being able to access the workforce. So I'm interested when you're saying around like the incentivization, is a good thing or a bad thing, and I don't have a full opinion on it, but I certainly think we have to do something, and I think the onus should be on government to ensure that people aren't at a loss for taking up work, that we're so proud of our full employment figures. But also that, I suppose, if there are organisations that are apprehensive, like what is being done, to help them meet their accessibility needs in order to be able to take on someone. Of course, they should have them anyways, but that's neither here nor there. But it really sticks in my craw when I've had people say to me, it's not worth my while entering the workforce. Like, that is a terrible state of play when we're the best country to do business in, and we're this, that, and the other. To me, that is a real stain and a blight on our state of our society right now, and I think it continues to be somewhat hidden underneath figures of full employment and when we don't have full employment in the disabled community, we don't have full employment in the traveller community and other areas.
Well done. Okay, we're coming up to 1 o'clock, so I'm just going to take two final questions. I have a man at the back and a man here at the side, so I'll let you go first.
Thank you very much. John Dolan is my name, and I'm a member of the polio survivors since the early days, and I certainly want to say that I've experienced an awful lot of voluntary disability organisations, and it is, and I want to say to those of you that are here, it is amongst the top ranking in terms of its effectiveness, even and involving people and membership. I have one theme in terms of my observations today, and it came to me as a result of something Senator Annie said, which was, who's making decisions? I think a lot of decisions are being made, but they're being made to forget about, to ignore, to push off, to not deal with. And I'll give you 3 examples. The cost of disability was first reported on in 1996 in a groundbreaking report, A Strategy for Equality, published by Minister Mervyn Taylor at that time. again in the early noughties, and it popped up 2 or 3 years ago. It was mentioned earlier. That's nearly 30 years ago. That's one example. The expressway buses. There is a Public Transport Regulation Act of 2009. Section 13 gives the National Transport Authority the right to set out accessibility standards for contracting companies, bus companies and whatever, and for rail and whatever. They're not using it. 15 years later, it hasn't been used. And the third point is the question has been raised about the mobility allowance. I'll tell you exactly what happened. On the 26th of February 2013, it was announced by government, and here's the irony, on the basis of equality legislation, that the mobility allowance was being scrapped and the motorised transport grant was being scrapped. They pressed the whole button, they scrapped the transport grant. As of that day, no more. Mobility allowance was continued, as they said, for a short time on the basis that they were bringing in urgently legislation to deal with the matter. 11 years later, no legislation, not one new person has been able to apply for that scheme, and has already been said by the man, I think, from Mulhubbard, the rate has stayed the same. They're examples of the kind of things that are and have been going on. But there's no reason the cost of disability can't be moved. I finally want to say that I think the last time I met Councillor Vicky was in Brussels, when your local authority, South Dublin, were getting an access award. And I think that's the only local authority in the country that has been given any kind of an access award at a European level. And I do want to mention, you mentioned her already, Selina Bonney, God rest her, who was a magnificent advocate. We've 900 plus local authority members now. There's people here from every local authority. That's where we live, and it's the practical things you've heard. So they're my couple. I think they forgetting about things. We've been all excited about things politically when it's in the news, and then next week it's forgotten about, and that is intolerable. And that's the biggest issue about making progress. Thank you.
Okay. And you're a sound advocate, John. I've met you several times over the years as well, and still going strong. Have you?
A small minority of people that are disabled, and that we represent the country, but we're only a small minority. So take that into account. Don't just say it's only us.
Oh no, and I think we all realise that. There was a question over here.
Hi, my name is Aziz and I'm from Limerick. I would like to bring your attention for the accessibility in the transportation in the public sector, private sector, like those bus companies such as Green Bus, CityLink or Flightlink. The majority of the buses are not accessible for wheelchairs or scooters, and those, sometimes when you show up with your mobility scooter, they refuse your entry and they say you have to book it through their offices, and sometimes their offices don't reply you in time. So it's like the buses from Limerick to Dublin Airport or the Green Bus from Limerick to Dublin, and some of their buses are not accessible. So I think this accessibility issue is very important in the private sector as well. Like, you know, their buses should be more accessible for wheelchairs and mobility scooters.
Surely should form part of any tender, you would imagine. I'm going to take one very final one. There was somebody here at this front table, was there? Yeah.
I'd like to thank our two public representatives for coming here today. But the one thing that obviously both have in common, the practical experience of disability. And that's why I would probably even raise the issue that maybe the other people who are invited don't have the same disposition. But most of the examples that you actually quoted, for example, the training gap in Cork, etc., I've experienced all these myself. Now, just to actually give you an example, I only suffer from, as he says, suffer from polio in my right leg, which Jim Costa used to object to. He used to say, that's wrong. You suffer from polio. You don't have polio just in your right leg. So I tend to be less limited in what I can do relative to other people. But even getting off buses, the step is so high, it's very difficult for me to get off, and I've got to sort of hold the handle, etc., and get off. Now, so I must say, both of you are very impressed by the examples you have, especially from Dublin County Council, being from that constituency myself, of course. Now, what I would like to raise, the one thing that always irked me was the Department of Health's refusal to accept polio as a long-term condition. And the reason that happened was, once you get polio, for example, if you're a child, I got it as a child, you can have a fever for a couple of weeks. The fever then disappears. If you're not in hospital for a period, possibly more than a month or so, so what we are talking about isn't polio any longer at that stage. It's the after effects of polio. So I suffer from the after effects of polio, but I used to have write to the Department of Health years ago trying to querying, for example, the long-term disability or the long-term recognition of polio as a disability, and didn't get anywhere, of course. And of course, the reason is, I think there's a general fear that if you recognize polio as a long-term condition, then you've got to deal with the associated factors related to it, such as aids and appliances, etc. So I just actually like, the one question I'd like to, or the comment I'd like to make is, our Taoiseach, for example, who obviously has experience in this area himself, and who was an ex-Minister for Health, he could be a very appropriate person for our Fine Gael representative to approach.
Strike while the iron is hot.
Yeah, but I would like to actually thank Vicky and Annie for coming here today, and your presence to me is absolutely enlightening. It's tremendous. Thank you.
Well, that's an appropriate way to finish, and thank you for that, because that's exactly what I was going to say, and it has given you a chance to voice your concerns. It has given Senator Hoey and Councillor Casserly a chance to hear what those concerns are. They do have a vested interest, both, but it's brilliant that they came. They got an unfair burden. In fairness, there should have been 4 people. They had to shoulder it with just 2, so we really do appreciate your being here today. Thank you both. Mick, congratulations to you once again on your award, and ladies and gentlemen, enjoy your lunch.